The Hound of the Baskervilles chapter, I, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he stayed up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearthrug and held in my hands the walking stick, which our visitor had left behind the night before. It was a fine, thick piece of wood, topped with a bulbous silver knob. Just under the head was a broad silver band, nearly an inch wide. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the CCH, was engraved upon it, with the date 1884. It was just such a stick as the old-fashioned family practitioner used to carry, dignified, solid, and reassuring. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? Holmes was sitting with his back to me, and I had given him no sign of my occupation. How did you know what I was doing? I believe you have eyes in the back of your head. I have, at least, a well-polished, silver-plated coffee pot standing in front of me, said he. But tell me, Watson, what do you make of our visitor's stick? Since we have been so unfortunate as to miss him and have no notion of his errand, this accidental souvenir becomes of importance. Let me hear you reconstruct a Manby an examination of it. I think, said I, following as far as I could the methods of my companion, that Dr. Mortimer is a successful, elderly medical man, well esteemed, since those who know him give him this mark of their appreciation. Good, said Holmes. Excellent. I think also that the probability favors his being a country practitioner who does a great deal of his visiting on foot. Why so? Because the stick, though originally a very handsome one, has been so knocked about that I can hardly imagine a town doctor carrying it. The iron ferrule is worn down, so it is evident that he has done a great amount of walking with it. Perfectly sound, said Holmes. And then again, there is the friends of the CCH. I should guess that to be the something hunt, the local hunt to whose members he has possibly given some surgical assistance, and who have made him a small presentation in return. Really, Watson, you excel yourself, said Holmes, pushing back his chair and lighting a cigarette. I am bound to say that in all the accounts which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. It may be that you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. Some people without possessing genius have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. He had never said as much before, and I must admit that his words gave me keen pleasure, for I had often been piqued by his indifference to my admiration and to the attempts which I had made to give publicity to his methods. I was proud, too, to think that I had so far mastered a system as to apply it in a way which earned his approval. He now took the stick from my hands and examined it for a few minutes with his naked eyes. Then, with an expression of interest, he laid down his cigarette, and carrying the cane to the window, he looked over it again with a convex lens. Interesting, though elementary, said he as he returned to his favorite corner of the settee. There are certainly one or two indications upon the stick. It gives us the basis for several deductions. Has anything escaped me? I asked with some self-importance. I trust that there is nothing of consequence which I have overlooked. I am afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous. When I said that you stimulated me, I meant, to be frank, that in noting your fallacies, I was occasionally guided towards a truth. Not that you are entirely wrong in this instance. The man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a great deal. Then I was right. To that extent, yes. But that is all. No, my dear Watson, not all. By no means all. I should say, for example, that a presentation to a doctor is more likely to come from a hospital than from a hunting society. And when the initials are placed before that hospital, the words Charing Cross very naturally suggest themselves. You may be right. The probability lies in that direction. And if we take this as our working hypothesis, we have a fresh basis from which to start our construction of this unknown visitor. Well, then, supposing that CCH does stand for Charing Cross Hospital, what further inferences may we draw? Do none suggest themselves? You know my methods. Apply them. I can only see the obvious conclusion that the man has practiced in town before going to country. I think that we might venture a little farther than that. Look at it in this light. On what occasion would it be most probable that such a presentation would be made? When would his friends unite to give him a pledge of their goodwill? Obviously at the moment when Dr. Mortimer left the hospital to start a practice for himself. We know there has been a presentation. We believe there has been a change from a town hospital to a country practice. Is it then stretching our points too far to say that the presentation was made upon the occasion of that change? It certainly seems probable. Now, you will observe that he could not have been on the staff of the hospital, since only a man well established in a London practice could hold such a position, and such a one would not drift into the country. What was he, then? If he was in the hospital and yet not on the staff, he could only have been a house surgeon or a house physician, little more than a senior student. And he left 5 years ago. The date is on the stick. So your grave, middle-aged family practitioner vanishes into thin air, my dear Watson, and there emerges a young fellow under 30, amiable, unambitious, absent-minded, and the possessor of a favorite dog, which I should describe roughly as being larger than a terrier and smaller than a mastiff. I laugh incredulously as Sherlock Holmes leaned back in his settee and blew little wavering rings of smoke up to the ceiling. As to the latter part, I have no means of checking you, said I. But at least it is not difficult to find out a few particulars concerning the man's age and professional career. From my small medical shelf, I took down the medical directory and turned up the name. There were several Mortimers, but only one who could be our visitor. I read his record aloud. Mortimer, James, M.R.C.S., 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon from 1882 to 1884 at Charing Cross Hospital. Winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology with an essay entitled, Is Disease a Reversion? Corresponding member of the Swedish Pathological Society. Author of Some Freaks of Atavism, Lancet, 1882. Do We Progress? Journal of Psychology, March, 1883. Medical officer for the parishes of Grimpen, Thorsley, and High Barrow. No mention of that local hunt, Watson, said Holmes with a mischievous smile, but a country doctor, as you very astutely observed. I think that I am fairly justified in my inferences. As to the adjectives, I said, if I remember right, amiable, unambitious, and absent-minded. It is my experience that it is only an amiable man in this world who receives testimonials, only an unambitious one who abandons a London career for the country, and only an absent-minded one who leaves a stick and not his visiting card after waiting an hour in your room. And the dog has been in the habit of carrying the stick behind his master, being a heavy stick. The dog has held it tightly by the middle, and the marks of his teeth are very plainly visible. The jaw space between these marks shows that the dog's mouth is too large for a terrier and not large enough for a mastiff. It may have been, yes, by Jove, it is a curly-haired spaniel. Holmes had risen and paced the room as he spoke. Now, he halted in the recess of the window. There was such a ring of conviction in his voice that I glanced up in surprise. My dear fellow, how can you possibly be so sure of that? For the very simple reason that I see the dog himself upon our very doorstep, and there's the ring of his master. Don't move, I beg you, Watson. He is a professional brother of yours, and your presence may be of assistance to me. Now is a dramatic moment. Watson, when you hear a step upon the stair, which is walking into your life, and you know not whether for good or ill, what does Dr. James Mortimer, the man of science, ask of Sherlock Holmes, the specialist in crime? Come in. The appearance of our visitor was a surprise to me, since I had expected a typical country practitioner. He was a very tall, thin man, with a long nose like a beak, which jutted out between two keen gray eyes, set closely together and sparkling brightly from behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He was clad in professional but rather slovenly fashion, for his frock coat was dingy and his trousers frayed, though young. His back was already bowed, and he walked with forward thrust of his head and a general air of peering benevolence. As he entered, his eyes fell upon the stick in Holmes's hand, and he ran towards it with a cry of joy. "I am so very glad," said he. "I was not sure whether I had left it here or in the shipping office. I would not lose that stick for the world." "A presentation, I see," said Holmes. "Yes, sir." "From Charing Cross Hospital?" "From one or two friends there on the occasion of my marriage." "Durham, that's bad," said Holmes, shaking his head. Dr. Mortimer blinked through his glasses in mild astonishment. "Why was it bad?" "Only that you have unsettled our little deductions. On the occasion of your marriage, you say?" "Yes, sir. I married, and so left the hospital, and with all hopes of a consulting practice. It was necessary to make a home of my own. Come, we are not so far wrong, after all," said Holmes. "And now, Dr. James Mortimer, Mr. a humble practitioner, and a man of precise mind, evidently. A dabbler in science, Mr. Holmes. A picker-up of shells on the shores of the great unknown ocean. I presume that it is Mr. Sherlock Holmes whom I am addressing, and not— No, this is my friend, Dr. Watson. Glad to meet you, sir. I have heard your name mentioned in connection with that of your friend. You interest me very much, Mr. Holmes. I had hardly expected so dolichocephalic a skull, or such well-marked supraorbital development. Would you have any objection to my running my finger along your parietal fissure? A cast off your skull, sir, until the original is available, would be an ornament to any anthropological museum. It is not my intention to be fulsome, but I confess that I covet your skull." Sherlock Holmes waved our strange visitor into a chair. "You are an enthusiast in your line of thought, I perceive, sir, as I am in mine," said he. "I observe from your forefinger that you make your own cigarettes. Have no hesitation in lighting one." The man drew out paper and tobacco and rolled the one into the other with surprising dexterity. He had long, quivering fingers as agile and restless as the antennae of an insect. Holmes sat in silence, but the quick, darting glances he threw at our visitor showed me how much he was intrigued by him. "I presume, sir," said he at last, "that it was not solely for the purpose of examining my skull that you did me the honor to call last night and again today?" "No, sir, no, though I am happy to have had the opportunity of doing that as well. I came to you, Mr. Holmes, because I recognize that I am myself a very unpractical man, and because I am suddenly confronted with a most serious and extraordinary problem, recognizing, as I do, that you are the second highest expert in Europe." "Indeed, sir." "May I inquire who has the honor to be the first?" asked Holmes, with some asperity. To the man of precisely scientific mind, the work of Monsieur Bertillon must always appeal. "Then had you not better consult him?" "I said, sir, to the precisely scientific mind. But as a practical man of affairs, it is acknowledged that you stand alone. I trust, sir, that I have not inadvertently—" "Just a little," said Holmes. "I think, Dr. Mortimer, you would do wisely if without more ado you would kindly tell me plainly what the exact nature of the problem is in which you demand my assistance." Chapter 2. The Curse of the Baskervilles. "I have a manuscript in my pocket," said Dr. James Mortimer. "I observed it as you entered the room," said Holmes. "It is an old manuscript, early 18th century, unless it's a forgery." "How can you say that, sir?" "You have presented an inch or two of it to my examination all the time that you have been talking. It would be a poor expert who could not give the date of a document within a decade or so. You may possibly have read my little monograph upon the subject. I pewed it at 1730. The exact date is 1742. Dr. Mortimer drew it from his breast pocket. This family paper was committed to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death some 3 months ago created so much excitement in Devonshire. I may say that I was his personal friend, as well as his medical attendant. He was a strong-minded man, sir, shrewd, practical, and as unimaginative as I am myself. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for just such an end as did eventually overtake him." Holmes stretched out his hand for the manuscript and flattened it upon his knee. "Look at that, Watson. Note the alternating long and short S. That is but one of several indications which enable me to fix the date. I looked over his shoulder at the yellow paper and the faded script. At the head was written Baskerville Hall, and below in large, scrawling figures, 1742. It appears to be a statement of some sort. Yes, it is a statement of a certain legend which runs in the Baskerville family. But I understand that it is something more modern and practical upon which you wish to consult me. Most modern, a most practical, pressing matter, which must be decided within 24 hours. But the manuscript is short and is intimately connected with the affair. With your permission, I will read it to you. Holmes leaned back in his chair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes with an air of resignation. Dr. Mortimer turned the manuscript to the light and read in a high, cracking voice the following curious narrative. Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles there have been many statements, yet as I am descended in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I had the story from my father, who also had it from his, I have set it down with all belief that it occurred even as is here set forth. And I would have you believe, my sons, that the same justice which punishes it may also most mercifully forgive it, and that no ban is so heavy but that by prayer and repentance it may be lifted. Learn, too, from this story not to fear the fruits of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions whereby our family has suffered so grievously may not again be loosed to our undoing. Know then, in the time of the great rebellion, the history of which by the learned Lord Clarendon I most earnestly commend to your attention, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name, a most wild, profane, and godless man. This, in truth, his neighbors might have pardoned, seeing that saints have never flourished in those parts, but there was in him a certain cruel and wanton humor, which made his name a byword through the West. It chanced that this Hugo came to love, if indeed so dark a passion may be known under so bright a name, the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would ever avoid him, for she feared his evil name. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down upon the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, she was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now, the poor lass upstairs was like to have her wits bewildered at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths which came up to her from below. For they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville, when he was in wine, were such as might blast a man who said them. At last, in the stress of her fear, she did that which might have daunted the bravest or most active man, for by the aid of the growth of ivy which covered and still covers the south wall, she came down from under the eaves, and saws out across the moor towards her father's farm, some 9 miles distant. A little later Hugo went upstairs to bring some food and drink to his captive, and perhaps even worse, but found the cage empty and the bird flown. Then, as it seemed, the very devil took possession of him, for he ran down the stairs and into the dining hall, springing upon the great table, knocking over flagons and trenchers, and screaming out before the whole company that he would that very night render body and soul to the powers of evil, if he might but overtake the wench, while the revellers stood aghast at the fury of the man, one more wicked, or it may be more drunk than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her. At this Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds a kerchief of the maids, he swung them to the line, and so off he went over the moonlit moor with a loud halloo. For a space the revellers stood with gaping mouths, unable to understand all that had been done in such haste. But anon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed which was like to be done upon the moorlands. All was now uproar, some calling for their pistols, some for their horses, and some for another flask of wine. But at last their senses returned, and the whole party, 13 in number, took horse and started in pursuit. The moon shone bright above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. They had gone 2 or 3 miles when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt. The man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak, But at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden, with the hounds upon her track. "But I have seen more than that," said he, "for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels." The drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode onward, but soon their skins began to creep, for there came a gallop of hoofs through the silence, and a black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. The revelers drew close together, for a great fear was upon them, but they still continued over more, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These, though known for their valor and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip or goyle upon the moor, some slinking away and others, with starting hacks and staring eyes, gazing down into the dismal valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they started. Most of them were by no means advanced, but 3 of them, the boldest, or maybe the most intoxicated, rode forward into the hollow. Now, it opened into a broad space in which stood 2 of those great stones, still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the center lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear and of fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised a hair upon the heads of these 3 daredevil roisterers, but was that, standing over Hugo, and plucking at his throat, there stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eyes rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the 3 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming, across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the other 2 were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which should not condemn the innocent beyond that 3rd or 4th generation, which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, then, I hereby commend you, my sons, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. This from Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John, with instructions that they say nothing thereof to their sister Elizabeth. When Dr. Mortimer finished reading this strange narrative, he pushed his glasses up onto his forehead and stared intently at Sherlock Holmes. The latter yawned and tossed the end of his cigarette into the fireplace. "Well," he asked, "do you not find it interesting? For a collector of fairy tales, perhaps." Dr. Mortimer pulled a folded newspaper from his pocket and said, "Now, Mr. Holmes, we shall give you something a bit more modern. This is the Devon County Chronicle of May 14th of this year. It contains a short account of the facts surrounding the death of Sir Charles Baskerville." My friend leaned forward slightly, his face clouded with an expression of intense attention. Our visitor adjusted his glasses and began to read. "The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville, who was considered a likely candidate for the upcoming elections in mid-Devon, has cast a somber shadow over the entire county. Although Sir Charles had lived at his Baskerville estate for a relatively short time, his kindness and extreme generosity won him the affection and respect of all who came into contact with him. In these days of the nouveau riches, it is heartening to see a descendant of an old county family, which had fallen on hard times, able to make his own fortune and restore his house to its former glory. It is well known that Sir Charles acquired a large capital through speculations in South Africa. More prudent than those who do not stop until the wheel of fortune turns against them, he realized his gains and returned with them to England. He settled at Baskerville only 2 years ago, and much was said of his grand plan for reconstruction and improvement, now interrupted by his death. Being childless, he openly expressed a desire that, During his lifetime, this entire part of the county should benefit from his prosperity, and many have personal reasons to mourn his untimely passing. His generous donations to local and countywide charities have often been noted in the columns of this newspaper. It cannot be said that the circumstances surrounding the death of Sir Charles were fully cleared up by the inquest, but at least much has been done to dispel the rumors sparked by local superstition. Be that as it may, there is not the slightest reason to suspect foul play, or that death resulted from anything other than the most natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower, and it may be said that in some respects he was an eccentric man. Despite his wealth, he had very modest tastes, and his entire domestic staff at Baskerville Hall consisted of the Barrymores, the husband being the butler and the wife the housekeeper. Their testimony, supported by the evidence of several friends, shows that Sir Charles's health had recently begun to fail, and that he suffered from a heart condition manifested by changes in complexion, breathlessness, and acute bouts of nervous exhaustion. Dr. James Mortimer, the friend and physician of the deceased, testified to the same effect. The circumstances of the case are quite simple. Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit of walking down the famous yew alley before retiring for the night. The Barrymores testified to this habit. On the 14th of May, Sir Charles announced his intention to depart for London the following day and ordered Barrymore to pack his things. That evening, he went out for his usual night walk, during which he was accustomed to smoking a cigar. From this walk, he was destined never to return. At midnight, seeing that the hall door was still open, Barrymore grew uneasy and, lighting a lantern, went in search of his master. The day had been damp, and Sir Charles's footprints were clearly visible in the alley. Halfway down this path is a wicket gate leading out to the moor. It was evident that Sir Charles had paused there for a moment, then continued his walk, and at the very end of the alley his body was found. There is only one unexplained fact, namely Barrymore's testimony that, past the gate, the character of Sir Charles's footprints changed, and it appeared as though he was walking not on his full soles, but only on his toes. One Murphy, a gypsy horse dealer, was on the moor at that time, not far from the gate, but by his own admission, he was dead drunk. He claimed to have heard cries, but was unable to determine their source. No signs of violence were found on Sir Charles's body, and although the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible distortion of the face, so severe that Dr. Mortimer did not immediately recognize his friend and patient, it was explained that such symptoms occur in cases of suffocation and death by cardiac paralysis. This explanation was provided during the autopsy, which proved that Sir Charles had long suffered from organic heart disease, and the coroner reached his verdict based on medical testimony. It is well that everything was thus explained, for it is of the utmost importance that Sir Charles's heir should settle at the Hall and continue the good work so sadly interrupted. Had the prosaic conclusion of the coroner not put an end to the romantic stories whispered about this death, it would have been difficult to find a master for Baskerville. It is said that the next of kin and heir is Sir Henry Baskerville, the son of Sir Charles's younger brother. According to the latest reports, the young man was in America, and inquiries are now being made to inform him of his inheritance. Dr. Mortimer folded the newspaper and tucked it back into his pocket. Those, Mr. Holmes, are the public facts concerning the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. I must thank you, said Sherlock Holmes, for calling my attention to a case which certainly possesses some points of interest. I caught a glimpse of several newspaper accounts at the time, but I was preoccupied with that little business of the Vatican cameos, and, in my anxiety to oblige the Pope, I lost touch with several interesting English cases. This article, you say, contains all the public facts. It does. Then tell me the private ones. With these words, Holmes leaned back in his chair, put his fingertips together, and assumed his most impassive, judicial expression. In doing so, said Mortimer, who was beginning to show signs of strong emotion, I am telling you something which I have never confided to anyone. One of my reasons for withholding it from the inquest is that a man of science shrinks from being suspected of sharing a popular superstition. A second reason was that the Baskerville estate, as the newspaper mentions, would surely remain without an owner if anything were to strengthen its already somber reputation. For both these reasons, I felt justified in saying less than I knew, since no practical good could result from my frankness. But with you, I have no reason for any such concealment. The moor is very sparsely populated, and those who live near each other are in constant contact. For this reason, I saw Sir Charles Baskerville frequently, except for Mr. Franklin of Laughter Hall and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist. There is not another educated man for many miles. Sir Charles led a secluded life, but his illness brought us together, and the bond was maintained by our shared interest in science. He had brought back much scientific information from South Africa, and we spent many a charming evening discussing the comparative anatomy of the Bushman and the Hottentot. During these last few months, it became increasingly clear to me that Sir Charles's nerves were strained to the breaking point. The legend I read to you had taken such a hold of him that, although he walked within the bounds of his own estate, nothing could induce him to go out upon the moor at night, incredible as it may seem to you, Mr. Holmes. He was honestly convinced that a dreadful fate hung over his family, and certainly the stories he told his ancestors were not of a reassuring nature. He was haunted by the idea of some ghastly presence, and more than once he asked me whether I had seen any strange creature during my medical journeys, or if I had heard the sound of baying. This last question he put to me several times, and always his voice would tremble with agitation. I remember well how, about 3 weeks before the fatal event, I drove up to his house. He was standing at the hall door. I had just climbed down from my trap when I saw his eyes fixed over my shoulder, filled with a look of most ghastly horror. I turned and caught only a fleeting glimpse of something that I took to be a large black calf passing behind the carriage. Sir Charles was so agitated and alarmed that I hurried to the spot where I had seen the animal to catch it, but it had vanished, and the incident seemed to produce the most distressing impression upon him. I stayed with him all evening, and it was then, to explain his emotion, that he entrusted me with the manuscript I have just read to you. I mention this small episode because it takes on a certain significance in light of the tragedy that followed. Though at the time, I was convinced the incident was trivial and that Sir Charles's alarm was without foundation. It was I who advised him to go to London. I knew that his heart was not right, and the constant fear in which he lived, however chimerical its cause, was clearly affecting his health. I thought that a few months spent in the distractions of the city would send him back to us a renewed man. Mr. Stapleton, our mutual friend, who was also concerned about his health, was of the same opinion. At the very last moment before his departure, the terrible catastrophe occurred. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore the butler, who found the body, sent the groom Perkins on horseback for me, and as I had not yet gone to bed, I was at Baskerville Hall within an hour of the event. I checked and confirmed all the facts mentioned at the inquest. I followed the footsteps down the yew alley. I saw the spot by the wicket gate where Sir Charles had apparently stood. I noted the change in the shape of the prints from that point onward. I satisfied myself that there were no other marks upon the soft gravel except those of Barrymore. And finally, I carefully examined the body, which had not been touched until my arrival. Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms outspread, his fingers dug into the earth, and his features were so convulsed by some strong emotion that I could hardly have sworn to his identity. There were, indeed, no signs of violence upon the body, but one statement made by Barrymore at the inquest was incorrect. He said that there were no traces upon the ground around the body. He did not notice any, but I did some distance away, but fresh and clear. Footprints. A man's or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer looked at us in a strange way, and his voice sank almost to a whisper as he answered, "Mr. Holmes, I saw the footprints of a gigantic hound." Chapter 3. The Problem. I confess that at these words a shudder passed through me. There was a thrill in the doctor's voice which showed that he himself was deeply moved by what he told us. Holmes leaned forward in his excitement, and his eyes kindled with that hard, dry luster which shot from them when he was keenly interested. "You saw them as clearly as I see you, and you said nothing? What was the use? How was it that no one else saw them?" "The marks were some 20 yards from the body, and no one gave them a thought. I don't suppose I should have noticed them myself if I had not known the legend. There are many sheepdogs on the moor. No doubt, but this was no sheepdog. You say it was large, enormous, but it had not approached the body? No. What was the night like? Damp and raw. But it was not actually raining? No. What is the alley like? There are 2 lines of old yew hedge, 12 feet high and impenetrable. The walk between them is about 8 feet broad. Is there anything between the hedges and the walk? Yes. There is a strip of grass about 6 feet broad on either side. I understand that the yew hedge is penetrated at one point by a gate? Yes, the wicket gate, which leads onto the moor. Is there any other opening? None. So that to reach the yew alley one must either come down it from the house, or else enter by the moor gate. There is an exit through a summer house at the far end. Had Sir Charles reached this? No, he lay about 50 yards from it. Now, tell me, Dr. Mortimer, and this is very important, the marks which you saw were on the path and not on the grass? No marks could show on the grass. Were they on the same side of the path as the gate? Yes, they were on the edge of the path on the same side as the gate. You interest me exceedingly. Another point, was the wicket gate closed? Closed and padlocked. How high was it? About 4 feet high. Then anyone could have climbed over it? Yes. And what marks did you see by the wicket gate? None in particular. Good heaven! Did no one examine it? I examined it myself. And found nothing? It was all very confused. Sir Charles had evidently stood there for 5 or 10 minutes. How do you know that? Because the ash had twice dropped from his cigar. Excellent. This is a colleague after our own heart, Watson. But the marks! He had left his own marks all over that little patch of gravel. I could discern no others. Sherlock Holmes struck his knee with an expression of annoyance and exclaimed, "If I had only been there! It is evidently a case of extraordinary interest, and one which presented immense opportunities to the scientific expert. That page of gravel, which I might have read so easily, has been long ere this smudged by the rain and defaced by the clogs of curious peasants. Oh, Dr. Mortimer, to think that you should not have called me in. You have indeed a great responsibility to answer for. I could not call you in, Mr. Holmes, without disclosing these facts to the world, and I have already given you my reasons for not wishing to do so. Besides, why do you hesitate? There is a realm in which the most keen and experienced detective is helpless. You mean to say that the matter is supernatural? I did not precisely say that. No, but you evidently think it. Mr. Holmes, since the tragedy, several incidents have come to my attention which are difficult to reconcile with the natural order of things. For example, I have learned that prior to this terrible event, several people had seen a creature upon the moor that corresponds to this Baskerville demon, a creature which cannot be any animal known to science. All who saw it described it as a huge creature, luminous, ghastly, and spectral. I have cross-examined these men, one a hard-headed countryman, another a blacksmith, the third a moorland farmer, and they all tell the same story of this strange apparition, which exactly matches the hellhound of the legend. I assure you that a reign of terror exists in the district, and he is a brave man who will venture across the moor at night. And you, a man of science, believe that a supernatural force is at work here? I do not know what to think. Holmes shrugged his shoulders and said, "So far, my investigations have been confined to this world. I have, in my own modest way, combated evil, but to take on the father of evil himself would perhaps be too ambitious a task. However, you must admit that the footprints were material. The hound of the legend was material enough to tear a man's throat out, and yet it was a creature of the devil. I see that you have gone over entirely to the side of the supernaturalists. But tell me this, Dr. Mortimer, if you hold such views, why have you come to me for advice? You tell me it is useless to investigate the death of Sir Charles, yet you asked me to do so. I did not ask you to conduct an investigation. Then how can I assist you? with advice as to what I should do with Sir Henry Baskerville, who will arrive at Waterloo Station. Dr. Mortimer glanced at his watch. In exactly 1 hour and a quarter. The heir, yes, upon the death of Sir Charles. We made inquiries about this young man, and learned that he has been farming in Canada. From all reports, he is an excellent fellow in every respect. I speak now not as a doctor, but as the executor of Sir Charles's will. I presume there are no other claimants to the estate? None. The only other relative we have been able to trace is Roger Baskerville, the youngest of the 3 brothers, of whom poor Sir Charles was the eldest. The second brother, who died years ago, was the father of young Henry. The third, Roger, was the black sheep of the family. He had the old, masterful Baskerville blood in him, and they say he was a very image of the family portrait of old Hugo. His conduct was such that he had to flee England, and he died in 1876 in Central America of yellow fever. Henry is the last of the Baskervilles. In 1 hour and 5 minutes, I shall meet him at Waterloo Station. I received a telegram saying he arrived in Southampton this morning. So, what do you advise me to do with him, Mr. Holmes? Why should he not go to the home of his ancestors? It seems natural, does it not? And yet, consider that a dark fate has overtaken every Baskerville who lived there. I am certain that if Sir Charles could speak to me at the moment of his death, he would have implored me not to bring the last of his line, and the heir to a great fortune to that accursed place. Yet, it cannot be denied that the prosperity of that whole poor, bleak countryside depends upon his presence. All the good work started by Sir Charles will come to nothing if there is no master at Baskerville Hall. Fearing that I might be led by my own obvious interest in the matter, I have come to tell you everything and ask for your counsel. Holmes thought for a moment, then said, In plain words, you are of the opinion that some diabolical influence makes Dartmoor a dangerous place for a descendant of the Baskervilles, are you not? At the very least, I maintain that the circumstances point that way. Quite so. If your theory of the supernatural is correct, it could work its harm upon the young man as easily in London as in Devonshire. A devil with merely local powers, like a parish council, would be too inconceivable a phenomenon. You would not take the matter so lightly, Mr. Holmes, if you were brought into personal contact with these facts. So, is it your opinion that the young man's safety is as well assured in Devonshire as in London? He arrives in 50 minutes. What do you advise? I advise you, sir, to hail a cab, call your spaniel, which is scratching at my front door, and proceed to Waterloo Station to meet Sir Henry Baskerville. And then you will tell him absolutely nothing until I have had time to consider the matter. And how long will that take? 24 hours. I should be much obliged, Dr. Mortimer, if you would come here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning and bring Sir Henry Baskerville with you. It would be of great assistance to my future plans. I shall do so, Mr. Holmes. He noted the appointment upon his shirt cuff and hurried out in his strange, peering fashion. Holmes stopped him at the top of the stairs with a final question. One more thing, Dr. Mortimer. You said that before the death of Sir Charles Baskerville, several people saw this creature upon the moor? 3 people saw it. And has anyone seen it since? I have heard of no one. Thank you. Goodbye. Holmes returned to his chair with that quiet look of inward satisfaction, which meant that he had a congenial task before him. Are you going out, Watson? Yes, if I can be of no help to you. No, my dear fellow, it is at the hour of action that I turn to you for aid. But this is a magnificent case, quite unique from several points of view. Would you be so good, as you pass Bradley's, to tell him to send me a pound of the strongest shag tobacco? Thank you. It would be as well if you did not return before evening. Then I should be very glad to compare impressions as to this most interesting problem which has been submitted to us this morning. I knew that solitude was necessary for my friend during those hours of intense mental concentration, in which he weighed every particle of evidence, constructed various theories, cross-checked them, and decided which points were vital and which were merely incidental. Therefore, I spent the day at my club and did not return to Baker Street until evening. It was nearly 9 o'clock when I entered our sitting room. My first impression was that a fire had broken out, for the room was so thick with smoke that the light of the lamp upon the table was blurred and dim. But as I entered, my fears were eased, for I began to cough in the acrid fumes of strong tobacco. Through the haze, I could dimly discern the figure of Holmes in his dressing gown, coiled up in an armchair with a black clay pipe between his lips. Several rolls of paper lay scattered around him. "Caught a cold, Watson?" he asked. "No, it's this poisonous atmosphere. I suppose it's a little thick, now that you mention it." "Thick? It is intolerable." "Then open the window. I see you have been at your club all day." "My dear Holmes, am I right?" "Certainly, but how?" He chuckled at my bewilderment. "You radiate such a delightful freshness, Watson, that it is a pleasure to exercise my small faculties at your expense. A gentleman goes out in rain and slush. He returns in the evening with his hat and boots still polished. Therefore, he has been stationary all day. He has no intimate friends. Where, then, could he have been? Is it not obvious?" "Yes, I suppose it is. The world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Where do you think I have been?" "Stationary also." "On the contrary, I have been in Devonshire." "In spirit?" "Exactly. My body has remained in this armchair and has, I regret to see, consumed in my absence 2 large pots of coffee and an incredible amount of tobacco. After you left, I sent to Stamford for the ordnance map of this portion of the moor, and my mind has been wandering over it all day. I flatter myself that I shall not lose my way upon it. It is a large-scale map, I presume?" "Very large." He unrolled a section of it over his knee. "Here is the particular district which concerns us. There is Baskerville Hall in the middle, with a wood around it?" "Exactly. I take it that the yew alley, though not marked by that name, must stretch along this line, with the moor, as you perceive, upon the right of it. This small clump of buildings is the hamlet of Grimpen, where our friend Dr. Mortimer has his headquarters. Within a 5-mile radius, as you see, there are very few scattered dwellings. Here is Laughter Hall, which was mentioned in the narrative. There is a house indicated here, which may be the residence of the naturalist Stapleton. If I recall the name correctly, here are 2 moorland farms, High Tor and Fulmire, and 14 miles away there is the great prison of Princetown. Between and around these scattered points lies the desolate, lifeless moor. This, then, is the stage upon which the tragedy has been played, and upon which we shall help to reconstruct it. It must be a wild place." "Yes, the setting is a worthy one. If the devil did desire to have a hand in the affairs of men, then you are yourself inclining to the supernatural explanation? And why should the devil's agents not be creatures of flesh and blood? To begin with, we are faced with 2 questions. First, has a crime been committed here? Second, what is the nature of that crime, and how is it carried out? Of course, if Dr. Mortimer's supposition is correct, and we are dealing with forces beyond the laws of nature, there is an end to our investigation. But we are bound to exhaust every other hypothesis before falling back upon that one. I think, if you don't mind, we shall close the window. It is a curious thing, but I find that a concentrated atmosphere helps a concentration of thought. I haven't quite reached the point of sitting in a box to think, but that is the logical conclusion of my convictions. Have you turned the case over in your mind?" "Yes, I have thought much of it during the day." "And what do you make of it?" "It is a bewildering business. It certainly has a character of its own. There are several distinctive features about it. This change in the footprints, for instance. What do you make of that?" "Mortimer said that the man had walked on tiptoe down that portion of the alley. He only repeated what some fool had said at the inquest. Why should a man go tiptoeing down an alley? What was it then? He was running, Watson, running desperately, running for his life, running until his heart burst and he fell dead." "Running from what?" "There lies our problem. There are indications that he was crazed with fear, before ever he began to run. What indications? I presume that the cause of his terror appeared from a moor. If that were so, and it seems most probable, then only a man who had lost his wits would have run away from the house instead of toward it. If we are to trust the gypsy's evidence, Sir Charles ran, shrieking for help, in the very direction where help was least likely to be found. And again, whom was he waiting for that night, and why was he waiting for them in the yew alley rather than in his own house? You think he was waiting for someone? Sir Charles was an elderly and ailing man. We may accept that he went for an evening stroll, but the ground was damp and the weather inclement. Is it natural that he should stand for 5 or 10 minutes, as Dr. Mortimer, with more practical sense than I had given him credit for, deduced from the cigar ash? But he went out every evening. I do not think he stood every evening at the wicket gate, leading to the moor. On the contrary, the evidence shows that he avoided the moor. Yet on this night, he stood there and waited. It was the night before his intended departure for London. The thing is taking shape. Watson, a sequence is appearing. May I ask you to hand me my violin, and we shall put all further thought of this case aside until we have the pleasure of seeing Dr. Mortimer and Sir Henry Baskerville tomorrow morning. AI voiceover direction. The running reveal. When Holmes says he was running Watson, his voice should drop any hint of casualness. It should be intense, certain, and slightly faster than surrounding dialogue. Logic and pacing. As Holmes lists the contradictions, the rain, the cigar ash, the direction of flight, he should sound like he is ticking off items on a mental checklist. The conclusion. The request of the violin should sound relaxed. The hunter has found the trail and can now afford a rest.